So this is the second of 3 standard variance problems. And so the first walkthrough, you may or may not have been able to do it by yourself. So this is the second one, and I hope you try to do it by yourself. And now I will do it with you, and you can check your work and see how it went and ask any questions. And then after this one, there'll be a third one, which you should by then be able to complete successfully and then check your work on the third walkthrough. So let's see how you did. So the first thing that I'm going to do is compare the actual purchase price times the actual quantity. Well, they tell us what they spent on food, so we actually didn't have to do the math. And then we want to compare that to what they bought times what they should have paid. So how many pounds of food did they buy times what they should have paid, which is the $6 per pound. And so the absolute difference between those is this 43.3, and this is favorable. They spent less on food than what the standard permitted. All right, now the middle term is a little different for materials because the actual quantity for the usage variance is how much they used, not how much they purchased. So the actual quantity used times the standard price. And then what should they have used? Well, that depends on how many passengers, because the food or the materials in this case are per passenger. All right, so we have this many passengers times that many pounds per passenger, and then it should have been $6 per pound. So then we take the absolute value of the difference, and this is unfavorable because what we the number of pounds consumed was greater than what was allowed per passenger, so this is unfavorable. So for labor, they tell us what they paid for labor, so we don't have to multiply that out. That's actual quantity times actual price. And so then how many labor hours were worked, and then what should we have paid per hour, and then the absolute value difference there, and it is favorable because what was paid was less than what the standard would have paid them for each of those hours. And then for efficiency, we say, okay, given how many passengers there were and how much time you should have spent per passenger at the rate you should have paid it, we should have been incurring that much. So the absolute value between the difference between them, in this case, this is unfavorable. All right, so that's the labor efficiency variance. For the variable overhead, we have what was actually incurred or spent. And then here, the variable overhead is per direct labor hour. So for each labor hour worked, we think the variable overhead associated with that should be about $7 an hour. And then how many hours should they have worked given the number of passengers? So 0.09, and then the variable overhead should be about $7 each. So then we can take the absolute value, and this is favorable, and this is un. For fixed overhead, we have what was incurred, and now we need the static budget. So the static budget is going to be what was at the beginning of the year. So at the beginning of the year, they thought there were going to be 690 passengers and then budgeted $12 per labor hour. So how many labor hours were originally budgeted? Times that will give you the labor hours, and that will give you the fixed overhead in total. Now what would be applied to work in process? So each of the standard labor hours allowed would have gotten, so let's get what that would be, passengers times the labor hours allowed times the $12. All right, and let's get the absolute value of the difference. Tiny difference there. All right, we have a favorable volume variance, and we have an unfavorable fixed overhead spending variance. So those are the calculations. Now let's go back to the story and interpret what these mean. So the original story, they are trying to evaluate a new crew, and we want to see how the new crew did. Preparation of food and delivery is the single most important part of the cruise, so let's have a look and see how they did. So they paid a lot less for the food than they were allowed to pay, and they used more food than what they were allowed. So I don't know if they bought it in more raw form and had to do more prep, or had to throw more out because it was cheap and therefore it wasn't presentable, didn't display well. Who knows? That would be something to ask. But these two offset. So they paid a little bit less, but they used a lot more. So that may not have been a good trade-off. What about the labor? So they paid less for labor, and labor was a little slower. So that offset is favorable. The cheaper labor was cheap enough to have offset the fact that they took a little longer. The variable overhead variance is mirroring the labor variance in terms of unfavorable, because the variable overhead apparently is very tied to the supporting costs for labor. So when labor goes up, so do the related overhead costs that are that support labor, the hiring and the services and the bunk cost and feeding them and whatever else you have to do for the crew on a cruise boat. There's not anything particularly meaningful that you can interpret out of fixed overhead, especially in this particular story, because fixed overhead is fixed. And you can tell from the variance, very, very tiny, that not much is going on. And the volume variance just tells you whether or not the number of passengers was higher or lower than originally planned. So that's not a performance measure for management. So how did the new crew do? Well, they're on a learning curve, perhaps. It talks here about what else might you want to know. If this is their first cruise or their first few cruises, then they're probably on training wages, and that's why we're getting a favorable variance here, and they're probably a little bit inefficient. So it's probably too early to see how this is going. We probably need to collect data for a little longer than just the first few cruises to make sure that this unfavorable efficiency variance drops off as they learn their tasks. And then, of course, the favorable labor rate variance is probably also going to soften as the probationary period passes and they get their first raises. So these may be temporary variances. I'm not sure about the food variances. You might want to ask about whether they should buy slightly higher quality food, where there would be less waste. That's something to be investigated, maybe independent of what's going on with hiring new workers at a lower rate who are a little bit slower because they have a learning curve. All right, I hope that went well for you, and we'll get the third one up here in a few minutes.